Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this press briefing by the European Union. We have two speakers for you today. I'll just introduce them. They are Sarah Blau from the Luxembourg delegation. Luxembourg, as you know, currently holds the presidency of the Council of the EU, and Elena Bardram, who is the head of the EU delegation from the European Commission. So we'll start with some opening remarks from our speakers, and then we'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Let me just take a moment to thank first our French host for their warm welcome and for their leadership and resilience, as they take us into the final stretch of these negotiations. We have come to Paris to finish what we started in Durban 4 years ago, to adopt a legally binding global climate change agreement applicable to all parties that will put the world on track to achieve our target of keeping global warming below 2 degrees. Avoiding dangerous climate change is a top priority for leaders across the world. We all heard this on Monday. Their first-hand accounts gave us a clear picture of how climate change is affecting citizens in every country of the world, changing lives and livelihoods on every continent. The political will to achieve a universal and binding global agreement can be in no doubt, and we know it is more than just words. The 185 INDCs, representing more than 95% of global emissions, are concrete evidence of the collective determination across governments to turn the tide on climate change. This is a groundbreaking increase in coverage from what we currently have under the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, where only 38 countries covering around 12% of global emissions have binding target. The INDCs provide a glimpse of the potential economic transition ahead. For example, implementing the policies in China and India's INDCs alone would triple the world's renewable energy production. And the full implementation of the INDCs will lead to investments of $13.5 trillion in energy efficiency and low-carbon technologies over the next 15 years. The INDCs on the table, however, will not be enough to get us on our internationally agreed objective of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees, but they have significantly increased our chances to getting there. That's why it is crucial that the agreement puts in place the necessary framework to put us on track towards this goal. To achieve this, the EU has 3 priorities. 1, a strong, clear and operational long-term goal to indicate where we want to go. This will give all actors, public and private alike, a credible basis on which to make climate-compatible policies and investment decisions. 2, to avoid the catastrophic consequences of climate change, much more needs to be done in the future. The Paris Agreement must contain a mechanism that allows us to collectively track the achievement of the long-term goal and a process for progressively strengthening parties' emission reduction targets. Such a review mechanism is not just a central requirement for the EU, but for many others, including many of the most vulnerable countries. In fact, for all those countries that are genuinely interested in a deal that keeps us within the 2 degrees. 3, and this is really critical to a credible agreement, we need multilaterally agreed common rules on transparency and accountability. The coming days will be crucial. We are already halfway through the first week. It goes so quickly, so we have no time to lose. Negotiators will need to work quickly and flexibly. We must have a concise text with clear political options to present to ministers at the end of the week. While we work on the new global agreement for the period after 2020, we mustn't forget the importance of action to reduce emissions before the agreement enters into force in 2020. This will be essential in closing the gap between current pledges and the below 2 degrees objective. The Lima Paris Action Agenda, an initiative of the Peruvian and French COP presidencies aimed at catalyzing multi-stakers action, is closely linked to this. The experience gained with policies and measures implemented in many countries pre-2020 need to be shared to incentivize more ambition in all countries. The EU has, for instance, been able to reduce its emissions very significantly while growing its economy. During the COP, we can expect new announcements and hear about inspiring initiatives at the program of events that has been organized around the themes of the action agenda. Let me just remind you that more than 100 side events will be held at the EU Pavilion, mirroring these daily themes, and you're welcoming to attend these. And now I will pass the floor to Elina.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon to you all. As Sarah said, we're very encouraged by the political impetus and push provided by the leaders' event on the first day. The leaders were all united in their call for an ambitious deal. They tasked us as negotiators to do our utmost. However, while the leaders have now set a clear direction, there is no room for complacency. It is obvious that the hard work has only just started. We started this final session with a 51-page text and far too many options on the table. Negotiators, they need to get down to do the serious work of shortening and sharpening the text. At this stage in the process, we need to be looking for common ground and not reverting back to outdated rhetoric. The EU is ready to act as a bridge builder and to engage in substantive negotiations. In the first week, the EU has been actively exploring possible middle ground, solutions that will take us somewhere. This has been done with our partners, and we will continue to work tirelessly towards win-win compromises. However, these are not one-way concessions. They are possible options as a part of an overall ambitious agreement. Arriving at such an ambitious package will require effort and movement from all parties. We are optimistic, but we have to see a step change in the process if we are to deliver a robust and ambitious agreement next week. We cannot leave everything to the ministers. For us, Paris Agreement must be credible enough to accelerate the transition to low-carbon economies in line with staying below the 2 degrees centigrade warming threshold. Sarah mentioned the 3 EU priorities. Let me just underline that the EU is by no means alone with these priorities. We have heard President Obama, many of the OECD countries, but also a lot of our partner countries in the developing world asking for these very features. A dynamic review mechanism that would allow parties to regularly come together to revisit the aggregate level of ambition and to step up the effort in order to make sure that the 2 degrees threshold is not passed. This is about getting the right deal and putting the world on the right path to avoid dangerous climate change. I would like to take a couple of seconds to address a point that's often considered too technical, but it's very, very critical to the agreement. The multilaterally agreed transparency and accountability rules. These are essential to show parties' progress on target, that parties are really delivering on what they have promised to do. It's not intended to be a punitive process. It is about facilitating progression towards our collective goal. And we do not have to start from scratch. We already have a system in place we can build on. The ongoing multilateral assessment process will be a valuable input into how we will be reporting and discussing issues in the post-2020 monitoring, reporting, and verifying systems. In this context, the EU really welcomes the completion in Paris of the first round of multilateral assessment. It has provided us with excellent input and excellent experience on how these types of dialogues can work. These assessments will continue to contribute to understanding mutual efforts and building trust and transparency around parties' commitments, and they are the very first steps towards a real accountability system involving all parties. The EU also acknowledges that solutions must be found in response to the need for support, including financing. We need to be able to show those countries that are vulnerable to the negative consequences of climate change that the climate agreement is also about global solidarity and caring, inclusiveness and multilateral action. It is clear that public finance from the EU and other countries will continue to play an important role in the coming years. In 2014 alone, EU and its member states delivered 14.5 billion in public financing to support climate action in developing countries. Public financing for adaptation from the EU and its member states has also increased, and we will continue to work towards its increase in the future. Public financial institutions have a key role in unlocking more private finance, which will be key to scaling up investment in climate-smart development across the world. There is still a lot of work ahead of us. We are now at a critical juncture in the negotiations, and we can't fail this last hurdle. The finishing line is in sight, but we don't have quite the race in the pocket yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Elina. Now, I'm hoping that we've got some microphones, and if you could just tell us, please, who you are and the organisation you represent, and we'll start in the front row, please, here.
Thank you. My name is Gerard Wynne. I'm writing for Climate Home. Elina mentioned the importance of solidarity. So I was interested in the EU's view on the Climate Vulnerable Forum statement on particularly 1.5 degrees and post-2020 finance. Thank you.
We find the Climate Vulnerable Forum a really worthwhile initiative. It's a great effort, and it shows that partner countries that have special interest and legitimate interest can work constructively together and voice their particular priorities. When I was talking about the EU priorities that we are not alone on, if you look at the Climate Vulnerable Forum's Manila Declaration, it has a lot of the key kind of requirements that we just outlined. It has the regular dynamic review element, it has the progression over time in terms of upping ambition, and it has the notion of transparency and accountability regime. And I think these are such shared important priorities, and it's heartening to see parties around the world coming together on things like this. As what comes to the 1.5 degrees specifically, the EU favours the most ambitious deal. The 2 degrees is something that we've taken from the scientific reports as the threshold for avoiding the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. We are ready and available to discuss different formulations of the long-term goal. It is important that we have a clear signal to businesses, investors and the wider, broader audience about the seriousness of government's action to transition to low carbon.
Can I take the gentleman in the second row, please?
Yes, Mats J. Larsson. I work for Dagens Nyheter newspaper in Stockholm. I made an interview yesterday with a Polish new environmental minister, and he told me that he wants to discuss the EU position in Paris, and also that the legal framework that is discussed needs to be discussed again. What is your reaction to that? And a follow-up question on that is, what about the criticism from environmental groups that the EU is sitting in the back of the room, not being in the forefront of these negotiations?
Okay. I'll try to respond to your questions. I mean, on the Polish government, I mean, we actually had a meeting. I mean, my minister, for instance, had a meeting yesterday with the new Polish minister, and he has reassured us that they are fully committed. I mean, the EU mandate is set out by the conclusions of the 18th September, and the Council remains with changing governments, but this has been very much confirmed by the new government that they are fully behind the EU mandate as set out by the Environment Council. So we see very much, we know that the Polish government has kind of raised some general concerns, but these are more like kind of in terms of later implementation of the at least 40 target, but we have the understanding that the Polish government will be standing fully behind the EU in the next 10 days. On the second question on the EU sitting behind, okay, maybe I have a wrong perception because I'm part of the EU team, but I think we are definitely participating. We actually, when you referred now to the Manila Declaration, which just came out jointly from a meeting with vulnerable countries, and we are very actively working with other groups, vulnerable groups, also progressive countries, and kind of building on the traditional EU bridge building role.
Take the lady in the front row, please.
Hi, Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Thank you. I have a question on legally binding. Mm-hmm. What I think I understand now is that Europe is kind of indicating that they understand that the U.S. can't have legally binding targets, but that the EU is trying to ensure that countries shall put forward policies that put forward policies in place to meet their targets, but you're getting pushback on even that from the U.S. Can you tell me, is that accurate, or like what is this conversation at now, and why do you feel like you're getting pushback on even putting policies in place, if that's right?
Let me first start by saying that the EU position has not changed on this. We strongly favour legally binding mitigation targets. At the same time, as is the case in all negotiations, you have to hear the other party out. You have to consider that the circumstances that allow us to arrive at the most credible, most universal, inclusive and dynamic agreement. The robustness, the credibility of this deal is not going to be assessed as a function of a single item. It is going to be a function of the ambition level under the different chapters of the agreement, if you like. That means the transparency and accountability rules. That means how the mitigation commitments are anchored, how it is formulated that these commitments will be implemented, shall be implemented. And there are lots of shades of grey that together can deliver a very robust, very credible package that can take us forward to the 2 degrees pathway. So the negotiations are ongoing. There has been no concessions from the EU side, but we are, of course, like others, looking at solutions that will allow us to arrive at the outcome.
Yes, we'll take a question over here, please.
Hi, Özge Kara from Turkey, Open Radio. I would like to learn what you think about Turkey's very unambitious INDC, given that Turkey is now still, the talks about joining EU is on the table. I think it's important. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really good question. We have chosen not to ex ante comment on individual INDCs, simply because we believe that that's a conversation that needs to be had in a kind of facilitative way to allow parties for themselves to explain why they consider their specific INDC to be ambitious, robust, and in line with the latest science. We continue these conversations with all our partners, including Turkey, and I think one of the things that we have considered useful in the context of INDCs is to see these as the initial articulation of the national vision. For many countries, these are the first time that they are coming forward with plans and strategies that are endorsed at the highest political level. It is normal that the first drafts, the first plans are conservative in order to avoid the kind of notion of failure. As we know from the EU experience, when you pursue policies, when you start the transition into low carbon, these measures become more cost effective and allow for kind of revisiting of the ambition. And that's why the dynamic cycle, having that embedded in the center of the agreement, is so very important.
Take a question here from the front, please.
Tang Zhiqiang from China Xinhua News Agency. Now some developing countries are making contribution to finance support, and they are willing to do so in Paris Agreement in a voluntary manner. Then as an exchange, will EU agree to scale up your finance support from the floor of $100 billion in Paris Agreement? And my second question is that we know that EU is open to the to review of the efforts pre-2020. Then what's your position on this facilitative dialogue of stock taking on 2018 or 2019? Thank you.
Okay, on your first question on the finance, we've been very pleased to see the second U.S.-China statement where China made a very big pledge, and that was really very encouraging to see that how things are. Actually, that the South-South cooperation is happening already a lot. As you know, this is going to be one of the questions to be resolved next week, and there are different formulations, whether it's countries in a position to do so, countries willing to do so, but this is definitely a very positive movement. It's clear that, the EU, we consider that we are not starting from scratch in 2020, and in a way what we have done pre-2020 will kind of inform the basis of what will happen post-2020, but we also believe that as for other issues like emissions, the world has changed, and this is why we see this as we will need more countries to participate, and we also need things like enabling environments in developing countries to get the right policies on board. So we see this very much as a welcoming step. On the pre-2020 ambition, in the European Union, all the policies are in place. We are already implementing 2020 legislation. We are actually, the latest data showing that we are on track and kind of not only 20%, but 23%. And we are in the process of ratifying. We have taken the decision last July to ratify the Doha Amendment, and the biggest majority of member states have already finished their national ratification procedures. So as
the lady there in the blue jumper.
Céline Serra from AFP Newswire. In the eyes of the EU, what would be a middle ground on the loss and damage issue? Thank you.
I think it's clear that the EU considers loss and damage issues to be part of the Paris Agreement. Whether it's in the decision text or the agreement text and what kind of formulation it has, that's still very much a function of the overall package. What type of configuration we get between the chapters and how we can take this forward operationally. We continue our discussions with those countries that have put forward, such as the G77 proposal, which has interesting elements in it. The placement of those provisions is still very much open.
And just to maybe add one sentence, it's clear that loss and damage will be one part package of the Paris package, and it is also something very, very important for our partners like the vulnerable countries, and so we have recognized this.
We have a question there from the front.
Polita Clark from the Financial Times. I came in a little late, so apologies if you've already addressed this. I was wondering, first of all, do you think there are many countries who are deliberately trying to block progress at the talks? And secondly, earlier today, organisers of the fossil fuel divestment campaign said that investors representing some more than $3 trillion worth of assets had said that they would avoid or cut their investments in fossil fuels. I'm wondering if you support that and if you think it's a sensible way to approach the problem of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
I think what we've seen so far is that it's the kind of logical, I mean, we saw the leaders come, we saw like a lot of fantastic statements. I mean, it was quite incredible to see all these leaders in one room. And then we go back to negotiations. And then as a negotiator, who moves first? The whole dynamics that you want to hold back. So I think that's also partially due to the working method. We have this contact group this week, but it's still pretty much just reporting back and forth what's happening in the different subgroups. And so there's no general overview, and unless you have a general picture, you can't start this give and take. Because for this, you need this helicopter view of saying, look, where's the general picture? So that's, in a way, we are very much under time pressure, but this is not really, I mean, yesterday at least, which was actually the first real day of negotiations at technical level, you got the feeling that there was a bit of a disconnect, but that's, we want to believe this is kind of the traditional start, and things will very much, or at least we hope, will kind of move forward much quicker in the next few days.
Fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies. That's a really complicated and difficult question, even at a global level. During the Leaders' Day, we saw a very interesting initiative spearheaded by New Zealand on the fossil fuel subsidy reform, and I think it's a space that requires careful political assessment, but also courage in looking at the broader implications of such initiatives and such work. But it's not a black and white area, so it's kind of difficult to give a single answer on this point.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we're out of time now, so thank you very much for coming and have a good afternoon.